I weigh the principles of true religious liberty, when I weigh the principles of the importance of public education and of health care and of care for the environment and racism and all these things, I clearly have to be a Democrat. Now, some on our panel may not be as Democrat as I am, and that's okay. But when I take my faith and the principles that I think guide me and what I get from Scripture and the life of Christ in the teachings in the Bible, I have to be a Democrat because they care about 20 times as much about the issues that I'm passionate about and that I think are right and wrong compared to my Republican counterparts. So tonight we're going to talk about how our faith has shaped us. So we have a great panel. We have Mike Collier, who's a senior advisor to the Biden campaign and also ran for lieutenant governor in our state and nearly won. We have Josh Houston with Texas Impact, a great organization that I worked with back in the 80s when I worked for Jim Hightower. We have Charlie Johnson, who is the executive director of Pastors for Texas Children, which is the leading advocate in our state for public education and fighting vouchers. Vouchers will destroy public education in this state. They're supported by our state's leadership. They're supported by Senator Cruz and Cronin. They're supported by President Trump, and they are evil. There's nothing good about the voucher programs that reward rich people for sending their kids to private schools. And Charlie will exaggerate. We'll talk more about that. And our final panelist is Dr. David Sapp, who I know is trying to get on. David and I worked together at the Christian Life Commission from 1978 to 80 in Nashville. He went on to pastor Second Ponce de Leon Baptist Church, and he's one of the leading religious liberty advocates in the state, in our country. So great panel. We'll have people of various faiths 2 weeks from now come back. But I want to welcome you all. And Mike, I want you to start first about how your faith has impacted your political values and why you've put yourself up for political office and why you're now working to help elect Joe Biden.
Well, thank you, David. And it's great to see everybody. I see some great friends. And so thank you all for joining. First of all, let me just sort of share with you sort of my religious upbringing. My father's Catholic and my mother's Methodist. And they were married in 1958. And back then, a Catholic would only be permitted to marry a Methodist if there was an agreement in writing that the children would be raised Catholic. So I was raised Catholic, and every Sunday morning, Dad and the boys would go to Mass. Mom would go to her church. She's Scotch-Irish, so there was no thinking of converting. And then we'd go to Mass, separate church, and then we'd come back and have lunch. And I just assumed the whole world worked that way. So I was raised a Catholic with a Methodist mother. And occasionally, I would hear that the only way to get your reward in heaven is to be a Catholic, and non-Catholics were excluded from that. Of course, I didn't accept that as real because my mother was a saint. And I came away from that experience as a very young man thinking that we really kind of have to find our own way. And I found my way, and that's just sort of where I'm coming from. And so my faith is very, very, very personal to me. I don't expect to force anybody to follow my lead. I expect to set an example. I think I'm called to set an example, but I don't think I'm required to have anybody do it my way. And I think that's the essence of, from my observation, as Democrats who are Christian, is that our relationship with God is our own, and we can witness and we can set examples, etc. But we also believe in the separation of church and state. We don't use government to sort of compel people to see the world the way we do. And I've always been very, very, very comfortable with that. In fact, I have a hard time conceptualizing any other approach. Second thing I'd like to say is a wonderful thing happened to me while I was campaigning for lieutenant governor. And when you're campaigning, you really are only permitted to talk about 2 or 3 things because it's a big state. You have no time to waste. Public education, as Pastor Johnson will attest, very important to me. But we were in Gulfwake, Texas, visiting with all of the Democrats in Gulfwake, Texas. And I had grown weary of making the same stump speech each time and figured that folks wouldn't object if I talked about something completely different. And I talked about compassion. And as raised a Catholic, compassion is a big part of what motivates me in my political life. I didn't realize this, but I was being videotaped. I was oblivious to this, but it was a fellow who put together a really cool 30-second video that suddenly showed up on Facebook, and it took off like a rocket. Just me talking about compassion, and that's why I'm a Democrat. And that to me was thrilling, because that was a license to talk about compassion everywhere I went. And what a joy to talk about compassion. And that's a big part of how we in our faith and express ourselves politically. When I read the Bible, of course, raised a Catholic, Catholics don't read the Bible as much as we learn religion from singing. And I used to sit and sing my heart out with my father. And the one bit of scripture that even this Catholic has committed to memory is Matthew 25, verse 40. Whatsoever you do to the least of thy brethren, that you do unto me. I mean, that summarizes all, I think, of what motivates me in politics, public education, which Pastor Johnson is going to talk about, and healthcare. Now, let me just pivot real quick and talk about healthcare. Because, I mean, we use terms that healthcare is a fundamental right. That's a political frame. We have a moral duty to one another, that we have the means to protect one another. We have the means to keep one another safe and healthy and happy and productive. And we have a moral obligation one to another. And healthcare is a huge part of that. And the fact that we refuse to take simple steps, such as expanding Medicaid, I'll use that as the one point of reference, but it applies to all the things that we do when it comes to healthcare policy. The fact that we don't take, the Republicans will not take that simple, cost-effective step to expand Medicaid and allow for millions of Texans to live not in fear and not worried about their family and not worried about themselves, but they have a doctor they can go to and they can keep themselves and their family healthy, which is a morally upright and appropriate thing to do, very consistent with everything that I know and feel about faith. Whatsoever you do to the least of thy brethren, that you do unto me. And we don't expand Medicaid, and the fact that Republicans won't expand Medicaid is based on a fraudulent assertion that it's a bad financial deal. It also happens to be a good financial deal. We're not here to talk about accounting, so I won't go any further than that. Hard for me not to talk about accounting. But the only other thing I'll say, David, is if you go through and look at the things that we're passionate about and the things that we fight for, you'll find that in the Bible that I read, but not just in the Christian faith, but you'll find it in just about, and I'm not a scholar by any means, but you'll find it in just about every organized religion. And I'll say one last thing, as a candidate, you get to go to all sorts of churches and see how it's done. And there are differences, but they're only slight in the grand scheme of things. You can pivot from a mosque and go straight to a Baptist church. And you'll see the differences. You'll notice the differences. But you'll notice more than anything else it's the same. It's all about man's humanity to man and our moral obligation to one another. And I'm so proud to be a Democrat and a Christian. It works beautifully together. That's my point.
Thank you, Mike. And that's so true, because it's about compassion. It's about kindness. I had a funny experience yesterday morning. I delivered 23 goats to the auction here. And as I drove off, the thought hit me. Of course, there were two young ladies there that go to Angelo State, and they're getting agriculture degrees. And they helped me unload the goats. And I thought to myself, I wish I had said later, I want to tell you two ladies two things. One, always be kind. If I could give you any lesson from meeting me one time, it would be always be kind. And secondly, please vote for Joe Biden. That's the thought I had when I drove away. So I'm going to do that the next time I encounter a stranger somewhere. Be kind and please vote for Joe Biden. Because being kind, I remember my son Chad telling me one day when he opened the door for somebody and held it, going into a department store, and he was about 16 years old. And he looked at me and he said, Dad, you're right. It doesn't cost a thing to be a nice human being. And there's a lot of truth to that. Well, I want to welcome some others here. Charlie Johnson, I'm on the board of Pastors for Texas Children. I'm what Charlie calls a trustee. But Charlie is the leading advocate of public education in the state of Texas. And now there is Pastors for Texas, for Mississippi children, Kentucky children. I don't know how many places, Charlie. You're going nationwide. You're on mute. Unmute yourself. Talk to us about public education. And you and I both know there are good Republicans, like my own state representative, Drew Darby, who is passionate about public education. But the reality is the leadership of the Republican Party is pro-voucher, pro-private schools. As Jerry Falwell said, quote, "I look forward to the day there's not a single public school in America," end quote. Charlie?
Hey, David, thank you. It's a pleasure to be on here with all of you. We've got a great group gathered here, and I'm just grateful for all the wonderful advocacy of all these folks. Mike, you're always an inspiration to me. You've got just the most knowledgeable and uplifting demeanor, and we're deeply grateful for your leadership in our state. Josh has been a colleague for years. We've traveled as fellow Baptists some of the same congregational paths. David Sapp's a dear friend of many decades. David Currie and I go back over 30 years. I was a pastor in Lubbock. David was doing his work down in San Angelo and throughout the country, particularly in Texas, but throughout the country in fighting Baptist fundamentalism. I don't think we need to elaborate about that to anybody in this meeting right now. Here we are still fighting it. Every human being is made in the image of God. This is the first thing we know in biblical faith, which encompasses Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. And that means that the human being is the imaginative crowning creation of God. And therefore, every human should be treated with dignity and respect and love. I believe the Democratic Party incarnates those values better than the Republican Party. That is not to say, as David has already noted, that there are not Republicans who do in fact live those values. There are, and many of those people will be voting for Joe Biden in November, and Vice President Biden knows that, Mike Collier knows that, Reverend Dr. David Currie knows that, and the Republican Party has lost its way, friends. It's lost its way. And there are millions upon millions of Republicans who testify to that with great grief. That's probably about all I need to say about that. I want to get back for just a minute or two to the biblical foundation of an inclusive ethic, an ethic of Christian humanism, if you will. I am a follower of Christ. I'm a servant of Christ. I'm a pastor ordained the last Sunday of this month 40 years ago in a little Baptist church in Mississippi. We must, God is sovereign. I don't mean to get too theological here, but God is sovereign over all creation. And every child of God is significant, is important, regardless of religion, regardless of denomination. Mike's already noted that. There are many different ways of expressing our devotion to God. This weirdness, the way the Republican Party has been co-opted by this right-wing fundamentalism, it's not really evangelicalism, you will hear that term, but those of us who have been theologically and biblically trained know that there's no good news about this very narrow, very rigid point of view. Evangelical comes from a Greek word, evangelion, which means good news. There's no good news in this. And so does that mean the Democratic Party is perfect? No, the Democratic Party is not perfect. Does that mean that we agree with all Democrats? No, goodness gracious. Diversity is a hallmark of the Democratic Party. We sort of affirm it's chaotic, it's a big mess. Here comes everybody, according to the Democrats. That's why we're not in lockstep. We don't have, all this sort of compliance like look, what has happened among the Republican Party with Donald Trump would never happen in the Democratic Party, right? We wouldn't have this look, you bow down in fealty and loyalty to me, or you do not have a place in this party. And so I think it's that look, you're going to hear it here. I think there are plenty of people in Texas who are rethinking the entire situation politically. I think that, of course, the demographic polling shows that, doesn't it? And David knows about this, Mike knows about it. I think the way that our senators have kowtowed to our president is outrageous, particularly John Cornyn, particularly. And they may try to hoodwink Texans in saying that this is some kind of moral values voting. It is not. And women and men of God in pulpits all throughout the state are drawing the line. David wants me to say a word about public education. It's a very important issue in Texas. Look, we rank about, what'd you say, David?
Please.
Yeah, and in the nation too.
This public education is the heartbeat of this country, and it's in the heart of God. You tell us that.
Well, that's our message, David, and thank you for being a trustee of that message and a trustee of that mission. David was one of the first people I went to when we formed Pastors for Texas Children. We're now in 8 states, in southern and midwestern states: Oklahoma, Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Florida, North Carolina, and Alabama. And we now have our 501c4. Mike knows this. We are doing engagement during political and electoral seasons. We want people to go vote public schools. Look, you can either try to change the knucklehead's mind fruitlessly, or you can change the knucklehead. And this is what we're going to do in November. And we're going to flip some seats. And we're going to have a legislature, as we say, that our children deserve, because education is the will of God for all children. In the old story, God brought all of creation to the human to see what the human would call it. It's in Genesis chapter 2. This is education. And this is just like God places the human in a garden. Why? Because every human being gets to eat. God has the human named creation because every human being deserves to be educated. So you have to have these provisions in order to be fruitful, multiply, replenish the earth, and subdue it. And so it is a basic human right. It is God's common good. All the people in the public make sure that all the children in the community are educated. If it becomes privatized, like the Republicans wish for it to do, holy cow. I mean, we knew that Ted Cruz threw in on privatization, but for John Cornyn to do this, and now to want to levy federal funds, a federal voucher, just because Betsy DeVos and Donald Trump want it, why can't Senator Cornyn go to the president and say, Mr. President, I'm not with you on this. I'm sorry. I represent the state of Texas. Texans have repudiated private school vouchers numerous times, session after session after session. And as David says, we've kind of been the tip of the spear in that, along with a bunch of other people. And thankfully, people like Drew Darby, David, and Gary Van Dever over in East Texas, and a lot of wonderful Republican state senators and state representatives too. And so public education is God's will. Healthcare, as Mike says, is God's will. I can remember Senator Ted Kennedy saying, it is a right and not a privilege. It is a right and not a privilege. And public education is a right and not a privilege. And I guess, David, with that, I'll just draw it to a close and we'll move to the next speaker. Thank y'all.
David, you're muted.
I got to unmute. Sorry, I unmuted. Sorry about that. Am I on now?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I've unmuted. I want to say, Charlie, one of the things I find so frustrating as a rancher, as someone who had a high school graduating class of 5, that's correct, 5, Paint Rock High School, that so many of my contemporary, my folks I grew up with, they vote Republican And they don't understand they're actually voting to close the public school in Paint Rock and Ballinger and Wall and Murchison and Cristobal and these communities around me. And they're doing it because they're single issue voters. They think if they vote for a Democrat, they're going to take their guns away. Well, I own 27 guns, people. Uncle Woolard's 12 gauge. Granddad Patton's 30 Remington. Nobody wants any of those guns. I have a 2-year-old grandson. He will inherit them all if he's the one that wants. But Republicans have convinced people about these single issues, so they vote to close their public schools over things that are never going to happen. Any reasonable gun owner would like to have better background checks, because if they're not, that's when I may lose my guns. Okay, the biggest threat to gun ownership in this country is the attitude of the NRA that wants to have no regulation whatsoever, and that's got to be stopped.
David, if I may,
sound serious, healthy is an important thing. Yes, sir. Go ahead, Charlie.
A quick story. I was with Glenn Rogers, a decent Republican. Chris and Mindy know Glenn. They did a yeoman's job getting Glenn. It's a Republican district. I don't think there's a Democrat running in the general anyway. The decision is made in the primary, the far right wing Empower Texans people versus Glenn Rogers, of conservative, but much more moderate Republican than his opponent, John Francis. Glenn came out in favor of what you just said. He's a rancher from Palapena County, Grayford, Texas. He's a rancher. He said, of course, I want people trained in guns. We need gun training. We need gun safety. Goodness gracious. They attacked him from every conceivable angle as being, anti-Second Amendment. This is what we have. Look, last I checked, y'all, the Bible says don't bear false witness against your neighbor. And I take no pleasure in saying this, but our Republican friends do nothing but bear false witness over and over and over and over.
Thank you, Charlie.
Can I just wait?
And I kind of ranted. Mike said a word, and I'll turn to Josh Houston. Go ahead. Go ahead, Mike.
I just wanted to say one thing. I'm reminded of the parable of the Good Samaritan. Doing right and living our values is hard work. I mean, to be able to deliver health care as we seek to, and Joe Biden, I should have mentioned this, I'm a senior advisor. He's very devout Catholic, and his health care plan is a very sensible health care plan. If you have your private insurance, you get to keep it. People who don't have access to insurance will have access to insurance. But getting health care right is hard. Making public schools work is hard. And that's also consistent with my religious upbringing. Doing right by your fellow man is not easy. It's hard work. And we as Democrats are prepared to do the hard work. And I can say, in watching the Republicans, they don't do the hard work. They don't do anything about health care. They're not doing anything about making our public schools successful. It's a lot easier for them to just try to scare us. As you say, Pastor Johnson, with going to take away your guns, even going to take away your God. That's one of the big differences between us and them, in my opinion, is that we're prepared to roll up our sleeves, take our lumps, do the hard work. That's what I think we're called to do. Anyway, thank you for allowing me to say that.
Thank you, Mike. And you had mentioned, but how many rural hospitals have gone broke in the last 5 or 6 years that would have been saved simply by expanding Medicaid? Because Ronald Reagan is who passed the law. If you show up, you have to be treated. And so it's a huge deficit on our county tax rolls, where our county's got to cover those injured people. And so the idea that we're not going to expand healthcare, people still get treated. It just costs us, and then nobody gets refunded for it, and we lose our rural hospitals. We could go on and on about that, but we're already down to 6:30, and I know there's going to be some answers sooner or later. Josh, let's go ahead and let's hear from you and talk about Texas Impact. Unmute yourself, Josh. Good to have you. It turns out Josh and my son know each other, so I'm thrilled about that.
Yeah, that's a long story short, but Yeah, I used to work with Lance back in my days with the Christian Life Commission and the Baptist version of Texas Impact. I'm Joshua Houston. It's a pleasure to be here with you tonight. I'm the Advocacy Director at Texas Impact. I am an attorney and a registered lobbyist for Texas Impact for the last 10 years. I'd like to take a second to introduce myself or my organization, because odds are I'm probably somebody's lobbyist on this call. Texas Impact exists to put religious faith into action. Our membership is made up of the denominations of the Christian, Muslim, and Jewish faiths that are here in the state of Texas. So if you're from the branch of Christianity known as mainline Protestantism, like Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopalian, Presbyterian, and you did not know that your church had a lobbyist before tonight, it's a pleasure to meet you. Our board is made up of representatives that are sent to us by those denominations. They set our legislative agenda, and we only take positions on issues they all agree on, but it's a lot more than you'd think and a lot more than they disagree on. I should note our partisan makeup. We are not politically homogenous as an organization. Our membership is about 50% Democrat, 42% Republican, and 8% crossover voters in a primary. Nevertheless, whatever I'd say tonight, I'd pass to anyone. Here, I'm most worried about the most fundamental American concept of one person, one vote. And so here's what my faith means to me on how to treat the least of these on November 3rd. Somewhere out there right now, driving home from work, there's a working mom with kids and a job. And she needs you to make sure that the wait to vote is less than 20 minutes. Otherwise, she is likely to get disenfranchised. That is the goal election administrators need to set, is that you can be in and out of your polling location in 20 minutes. In addition to that, no matter how November 3rd turns out, there are going to be people who feel that it was rigged or that it was unfair. And so to every clergy person that I get screen time with these days, I say, congrats, you're going to have to minister to that situation. And we in the faith community have not had to make a theological argument for one person, one vote in quite a while. If you go back far enough, churches are called the ecclesia because we took that name from the Greek name for the body that was the Athenian democracy. It's no coincidence that the political enlightenment of John Locke and Rousseau that brought us modern democracy followed the religious Reformation. The abolition movement was led by clergy, and that resulted in the Reconstruction Amendments, including the 15th Amendment and the right to vote and 14th Amendment equal protection clauses. And the Black church in America continues to call us to redemption in this country, and never more powerful than they did in the 1960s when they got the Voting Rights Act passed. They somehow never gave up faith that the vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by humanity for breaking down injustice. So how do we apply some theological principles to our modern time? For instance, how do you love your neighbor as yourself? How do you do unto others as you would have them do unto you? How do you really live out that there is no Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free? These are all principles of Christianity. And I should add, we're an interfaith organization, and if the way I always think about it, I'm unapologetically Christian, but if Jesus had a problem with other faiths, why is the hero of his story a Samaritan? You know, that's just one that's always, the Christian nationalism has just always been bewildering to me. Listening to faiths like Islam, Hinduism, Judaism, as they, in this job, I get to hear them apply their theology to our democracy, and it is a fascinating perspective. And it really embodies the original notion of e pluribus unum, that out of many, we are one. So I have some to-dos that I want to make sure that you do. The best way to defend democracy, we think, is to double down on your commitment to our institutions. And none are more fundamental than the right to vote. My number one worry that I have for the next 56 days, I think? 53 days, maybe? Anyway, in the next 53 days, I am terrified we're not going to have enough poll workers. Enough election judges is what we call them in Texas. With all the talk about voting by mail, 75% of Texans are going to have to go to the polls in person, conservatively. Going from 8% of the electorate that opted to vote by mail to 100% was not realistic for our counties. Success that I think would be successful is if we could get 25% of the electorate to vote by mail. That would be huge because it takes all those people who are eligible and not doing it previously, it takes them out of the line in the polls in person. If you can't do a 16-hour day, and I know how hard that is to be a poll, to be an election judge, consider being a poll monitor. And I put the links to all these things in the chat box, and I'll do it again. I'll check the chat box when I'm done talking. Especially if you can travel, being a poll monitor is super important. Poll monitors are the eyes and the ears of the election protection lawyers. There is a hotline of election protection lawyers that reports to a command center of election protection lawyers, and we report up to litigation teams that are ready and on standby to rush to a courthouse on election day to preserve the right to vote. So there are three kinds of poll monitors that you could be. You could be stationed at a place that we know has problems or has previously in previous years had problems. You could do it from your car and be what's called a roving poll monitor. Or you could do it at home online and monitor things like Twitter for complaints. And we have that link to do poll monitoring in the chat box. And then the number three thing, I want to make sure that everyone that is 65 plus is voting by mail and voting by mail early. I cannot stress early enough. We would recommend, it is not the legal deadline. The legal deadline to apply is October 23rd. Do not push that deadline. Make sure, we would recommend you apply by September 21st. The reason for that recommendation is because the counties will do a big mass mail out of the first round of mail-in ballots 30 to 38 days before the election. If you're being conservative and it takes a week for it to get to you, that still gives you 3 weeks to get it back to your county. So if you keep the deadlines, the legal deadlines out of play, voting by mail should still be safe. The post office should still be fine if you give it plenty of time. The real tampering that's going on is the tampering of the mind. It really appears as a real attack on the legitimacy of our processes. And I think that is the most concerning thing, which is why we say, get involved and double down on your commitment to democratic institutions. Be an election judge. Because if somebody comes along and says it's rigged, you can say, no, I was an election judge. I sat there for 16 hours. This is how it works. This is what I saw. And of course, no one can speak for the 10,000 polling locations in Texas, much less the other 49 states in the union. Don't take that perspective. It's too much. It's too big. Do all you can do where you live. And that's all you can do. Because then you're going to be able to tell your community what it was you saw. And the only way democracy is going to work is if we all do that together. So I want to conclude by saying Texas Impact is here to help you. In the chat box, I have put a copy to our publication on how to vote by mail. There is a link to that PDF. It is exhaustive and should answer any questions or any problems that might arise. But if that somehow is insufficient, call me. I'm an attorney. I want people to be able to vote. Number two, check your registration. Even if you 100% know you are registered, even if you voted in the last primary, check it anyway. I am really worried about purges. I'll just go ahead and say that to the voting rolls. There was a big controversy about that during the session, and we have no way of knowing until it's too late if it's really happened over the Secretary of State's office. And third, judges, being an election judge is the priority. We also know how big an ask that is given the pandemic, and not everybody's in the same situation. And if you cannot do that, be a poll monitor. It is also very important to be the eyes and ears for election protection lawyers. David, thank you for having me tonight. It's been a pleasure.
Well, it's great to have you, Josh. And what I like about that is the practical advice you gave everyone. My life was shaped tremendously by Dr. Nat Tracy at Howard Payne. I got there on a track scholarship, ran a year, but Nat Tracy changed my life. 2 things he said, 3 things. I could tell you 10 things he said. But one thing he said was, no matter how much you think of yourself, it's not as much as God does. And he helped me understand that God believed in me. That is so important. It changed my entire life. And then he always said, the kingdom of God is built not by the Billy Grahams of the world, by individual acts of kindness and compassion on a daily basis. You just shared with people, this is how you, who feel insignificant to try to change America, can make a difference by voting, by being an election judge, by doing those things, because the world is actually changed by individual acts of both compassion and courage. And you just shared that with us. I want to move now to the passion of passions of mine, and that is religious liberty and my good friend, Dr. W. David Sapp. I'm pretty sure if I die first, David Sapp will preach my funeral, and if he dies first, I get to preach his. I'm not sure if I think that's an honor. But he and I worked together at the Christian Life Commission in 1978 to 80, and we've been friends for over 40 years now. He shares my passion for religious liberty. I've written on various occasions, what makes America America is the First Amendment to the Constitution that guarantees religious liberty to all people. No other country had ever done that till we did it. It's the only reason we don't shoot each other in this country, at least till now, over religion like they do all over the rest of the world. It is a genius beyond genius idea of protecting religious liberty for people of all faiths or no faiths. And the Democratic Party believes in that. The Republican Party believes in Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism is not biblical and it's not America. But I'm shutting up, David. I want my friend David Sapp to speak now. David, go. You got to unmute first, son. Unmute. Unmute, David. You unmuted?
I'm unmuted on my end.
All right. Go. Rock and roll. Tell us
Am I
about
talking?
religious liberty, my friend.
Somebody hearing me?
You're talking.
You already.
We're hearing you.
On my part.
Go. You'll do great.
When I was pastor in Richmond, Virginia, a few years ago, I had one of our teenagers come to me and say, "This, yeah, I'll tell you, this is a few years ago, because it was during one of the Clinton campaigns." And he said to me, "Would you tell these people here with me that you can't be a Christian if you vote for Bill Clinton?" Well, set me to thinking. And I have come to the conclusion that I don't agree with anybody who starts a sentence with, "You can't be a Christian unless you vote for." And I think that's the historic Baptist tradition that I have fallen into, that I was born into, that I was nurtured on. And yet we are being told today, I don't hear anybody saying you can't be a Christian if you don't vote for Joe Biden or you don't vote for some Democrat, but I do hear people saying you can't be a Christian if you don't vote for Donald Trump or if you don't vote for whatever the Republican Party candidate is. And I think that's, while I want to say you can be a Christian, you can vote for a Republican, you can vote for a Democrat, I really, really think we're in danger when we start telling each other you can't be a Christian if you don't vote for my candidate. And the main people that are saying that now, unfortunately, are Republicans. Now, there are a few principles on which I stand, a few principles that I have inherited and that I have lived with for my life that I think speak to our issue here tonight. And one of them is I stand with my Baptist forebears to guarantee religious liberty for all faiths and not just for Christians, for all faiths or for no faith and not just for Christians. And yet we live in a time when we have become confused about religious liberty for all. And there are a whole lot of us who have come to advocate religious liberty as a thinly veiled attempt to allow discrimination based on our religion. We want to be able not to serve people or not to wait on people or not to like people, not to do anything for people who violate what we think are our religious principles in any kind of way. And that is not religious liberty. That is exactly the opposite of religious liberty in my understanding. Secondly, I have for my lifetime stood opposed to partisan campaigning on the part of churches. And yet the Johnson Amendment, which is an amendment designed to say that you can't do partisan campaigning as a church, is under Republican threat. It's under Trump's threat in particular, and I think that is a grave danger to us. And in addition, I stand opposed to the government funding of religious enterprises. And I know I'm in hot water with a lot of my colleagues and friends, but the CARES Act provision, which assisted churches in paying salaries during the COVID crisis, albeit through government guaranteed bank loans, in my view, is a violation of that principle. Unfortunately, both parties tended to support that, but those are principles that I stand on. Those are principles I was nurtured on. Those were principles that I was taught are part of my Baptist heritage and my Baptist identity and even my Christian identity. And I see them as under threat today. And I don't think we have anything to apologize for in saying that when we identify with Democrats, because Democrats are at least as good, and I happen to think better on these issues than most of my Republican brothers and sisters. That's a little bit of my thought about this whole matter of religious liberty. There you have it.
Unmute,
Oh,
David.
I got to unmute. Thank you, David. I appreciate that. When I keep hearing that Ted Cruz is a constitutional scholar, and I find myself saying, how can you be a constitutional scholar and you don't understand the First Amendment to the Constitution? Because the First Amendment to the Constitution guarantees religious liberty for everybody of any faith or no faith. And Ted Cruz doesn't believe that. He believes that he follows David Barton. If y'all don't know who David Barton is, you need to research him because he's one of the most dangerous men in America. He says only Christians are supposed to hold political office. I think he even goes as far as to say only Christians are supposed to vote. And it's a convoluted understanding of history that is wrong and is dangerous to what makes America America. Now, I've noticed a few folks on here with us tonight that we weren't on the original program, but Gene Collins is a friend, serves on the State Democrat Executive Committee with me. Gene, I want you to unmute yourself because I believe you're head of our African American leadership group in the state convention. And if you're on, Gene, I want you to say a word or two. Unmute yourself, please. I see you. Say a word to us, Gene.
Okay. Can y'all hear me?
Ken.
Yes, we can.
Okay. I am really thrilled to be on this call. I'm also a Church of Christ minister. I've been in the pulpit over 30 years. I attended Abilene Christian College, but I also graduated from Baylor University. So I'm still conflicted in having internal wars with myself. So these kinds of calls are very, very meaningful to me. As you know, we're going through a
Gene, you need to pay attention to that Baylor Baptist teaching, okay?
I know you're right. We're going through a cultural reformation, and in the African American community, it starts with the church. I am part of several think tanks where we're challenging the evangelical movement, calling them on the carpet for some of the beliefs, especially in the South. And those of you who are Southern Baptists know what I'm talking about. We still see that, and that's part of the structural racism that we see right now. It's ingrained, and we're working on trying to, through our ecumenical efforts, change some of that thinking. But I'm so glad that we have so many members of faith on the call. Josh, I was really impressed with your presentation. I have asked the Democratic Party to give us a actual toolkit for churches going forward. This election has a lot of challenges. One is that we don't vote straight ticket anymore. Of course, COVID-19, and the Republicans tried to pass legislation that limited how many people you could personally take to the polls. In the African American community, we do a lot of our polling through the church, things like Souls to the Polls, where members go collectively in church vans and things like that. We're going to try and step that up a few degrees this go round, but we need to make sure that we're doing within the realms of the law. I know the Johnson Amendment has been discussed once, but one thing our president has done is he has done that executive order saying that the IRS would not enforce the Johnson Amendment. I think that's a small window for the churches to become a little bit more active during this election cycle. So I hope we'll have some more calls, and feel free to get in touch with me, especially if you want a perspective from the African American community and what we're doing. I'm also an NAACP representative for all of West Texas. That's a big area. We have people on staff who are going to be watching the election activities. We have some lawsuits still in the courts now in trying to prepare for things like voter ID and the upcoming census. So I'm going to get off now and listen more. I just got on really to listen. And David, thanks for allowing me to speak.
Well, Gene, you're a real leader in the state of Texas and in the Democratic Party, and a leader in the Christian community. And you came when I met you, you came and spoke, and when you and I both spoke when we kind of reinstituted the NAACP here in San Angelo, and I'm really grateful for your leadership and all you're doing. And when I saw you were on, I said, the state of Texas needs to hear from Gene Collins. So I appreciate that. There are a couple other folks I've seen on, and they don't know I'm going to call on them, but Kim Olson, will you unmute and say a word to us? Because you're one of my favorite people in the universe. And I appreciate you so much running for Ag Commissioner, and I want you to run again. So say a word to us, Kim.
Well, I'll just say that I'm just one of the ones that would sit in the pews and listen to all of you. I'm a Methodist, and I married a Disciples of Christ guy. And so I'll just say this. I can think of no other place, especially in the ag world, in which, we are to be stewards of God's land. And part of that is how we do ag policies, and that we should have food security for everyone. So even though I ran for agriculture, I think many of the principles of feeding our humanity, making sure people have a meal, making sure that we are being good stewards of this land that we have, and that we are leveraging it appropriately for generations to come, all lies within the biblical principles that are out there. And I just, this is as farmers and ranchers and Democrats and even my Republican neighbors who happen to be Baptists, that we really frame our argument sometimes here.
Kim, we've kind of lost you. I think you're driving.
Yeah,
I think you're driving, and we kind of lost you, but I appreciate you saying a few words.
You betcha. Thank you, David. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Kim. Well, good to have the call. Kim is accurate. I'm not going to bore you. Please don't go read my dissertation, but it actually was titled A Critical Analysis of Current American Agriculture Structure in Light of the Biblical Teachings of Justice and Stewardship. Now, don't go read that. But the point is, I've got 2,400 acres in Concho County, and I don't own an acre of it. It belongs to God. I'm a steward of it during my lifetime and hopefully during my son's lifetime. But God owns my land. And I understand that. And we need to all understand that when people think that the bottom line is profit and not people, is profit and not stewardship, they've lost the biblical teachings of what it means to be a compassionate, caring person. I'm not threatened by the Green New Deal. They're not going to stop me from raising cows, for God's sake. But we need to take care of creation. Climate change is real, folks. Look at the freaking fires in California. I watched the 5:30 news tonight before we came on. This is insanity. And part of it is because we're not caring for God's creation the way he called us to care about it. And there is no concern for that on the side of the Republican Party. There is concern for that on our side. And we've got to keep working to that. I've got 4 minutes left. I swear I saw somebody that wanted to say something. You know what it is? I'm going to completely freak one of my best friends out. Ron, 2 words. Unmute yourself and say a word. Come on, Ron. I called on you.
I want to hear Nat Tracy's 10 points because I think that probably would describe being Christian and Democrat as well as anything you could say. And Josh Houston hit the nail on the head. All my other friends did too, but my goodness, he hit the bottom line in terms of helping people to vote.
Yeah, practical. We have to be practical.
That's right.
And I just want to say to you all, don't be ashamed of your convictions. Don't be ashamed of what you believe. You know, my neighbor just put up a freaking American flag with a Trump flag underneath it. And I told my wife, you know, he just did that to bug me. And the bad side of me wanted to put up a Biden sign because I share about a half a mile of fence line, every 8 feet for a half a mile. Well, you know what? That's not going to accomplish anything. I need to love him. I need to remember he's a child of God. And I need to remember he probably, as Martin Luther King said, we do a lot of things out of human blindness rather than human badness. And keep that in mind, but never apologize for what is in your gut, in your heart, and what makes you who you are, and stand up for it. This is one of the most fun things I've ever been a part of. And I want to thank you all for joining. I hope it spreads across the internet. And just remember, people are more important than anything in the world. And love the people you come in contact with, be kind to them, and know that a lot of folks just can't seem to know any better. So let's save our public schools. Let's save the First Amendment. Let's save our stewardship, our country, our values, and turn out to vote and do what Josh said. Give everything you've got between now and November 3rd. Thank you all for joining. This is a great privilege. Join us again in 2 weeks with Rabbi Jack Moline and some other exciting speakers, and we look forward to that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Thank you,
Shirley,
David.
take us away.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.